introduce Mr. Arnold Pelly, former chief and presently band councillor at the Grassy Narrows Reserve in Northern Ontario. As you may know, the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience, since its inception, has been concerned with matters of spirituality and with justice. Last year, Father Michael Stogry, a Jesuit priest in the position, who has worked on various Indian reservations, came to speak to us. Again this year, it is our extreme good fortune to have someone who has come to speak to us about the Native Indians. Mr. Pelly has direct and immediate experience in terms of the Grassy Narrows and White Dog reserves in the north, and it is about his experience as a native and his experience on the reserves with the government and whatnot that he's going to speak tonight. The program will be the following. We'll speak for about an hour, then we'll have our coffee break, and then we'll come back in again and we'll have a slide presentation in which Mr. Pelly will comment. So as I say, it is my pleasure tonight on part of the St. Jerome Centre for Catholic Experience to introduce Mr. Arnold Pelly.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know where to begin. I guess I could begin by saying that I'm a bit nervous, and I'm sort of shy as well too, so I thought I'd make that known. So in case I make some mistakes in the way I pronounce words or how I get things all mixed up in that, you'll understand why, because I'm a bit nervous and I'm kind of shy. And it's been quite a few months since I last spoke to in public. So I'll try to at least try to shed some light on what's been happening to my people, the people of Grassy Narrows. For those of you, maybe for most of you, may not be familiar with Grassy Narrows. Grassy Narrows is in northwestern Ontario, and if one is to look it up on a map, the quickest and easiest way of finding Grassy Narrows is to find Kenora, Ontario, and then from there you just trace your finger in the northeast direction, and it's above the Canadian National Railway line, and it's easily accessible by road, gravel road. It's about 60 miles, and it's about an hour and a half drive. For the experienced traveler in the north, you take a plane, which only takes you about 20 minutes. It'll save you all the washboard bump rides going up that road. Now, like I said, I haven't had a chance to really speak to a large gathering. I consider this to be a large gathering because back at home I'm used to speaking to about 10 people. That's the turnout that we have at our general band meeting. So which gives you an idea of what sort of interest that we have over in the community. Now, Grassy Narrows, as you know, maybe some of you people know, has gone through a drastic change over the past 10 years. At present, Grassy Narrows is involved to try to get a compensation settlement with the both levels of government, the provincial government and the Ontario government, as well as the paper companies for the pollution of their river. The river in reference that I'm talking about is the English Wabagoon River system, which was the source of livelihood of more than 450 people of the Grass and Narrows Reserve. And in 1960, in the late 1960s and early 70s, that's when the mercury pollution issue came to surface. And it had destroyed a livelihood. And today, the people of Grass and Narrows are involved in what we call the mediation process. And it's trying to get a settlement for the damages that were caused by the paper companies. Now, for one that hasn't been up to Grass and Narrows, you tend to get a image of swampy, marshy land. You know, that name Grass and Narrows also, you know, has that feeling of, you know, desolate feeling. But whatever the impression, first impressions when you first hear of Grass and Narrows, it will always be home of more than 500 people that have to live and work on the reserve for year in and year out. And as I said earlier, Grass and Narrows has been through a lot of changes. Now, in order for you to understand what sort of changes that I'm referring to, I'll first have to relate some history about the community and what it was like in the years between 1960 as far back as 1930s. What sort of lifestyle these people had back then. This will give you an idea of how we lived back then as compared to what we have to put up with today. And why I say that we had to adjust our lives to meet today's demands and challenges. And as you were told, part of the program will consist of slide presentations, which I will comment on after coffee break. The people of Grass and Narrows, back in the days of 1930, also back 1960, they were a nomadic type of people. They moved around quite a bit. They didn't stay in one place. They had their own traditional hunting grounds. Each clan had their own trap lines, as we call them. And their lives were geared to meet best with the seasons, because every season had a meaning of life to them. In the spring, the people would give thanks to have a feast in the spring. That's just to give thanks that they've been through another hard winter. And spring also meant time of living again. Because in the spring there's a lot of new growth, new life. It meant another season of happiness. And then in the spring, the people would get ready for the summer. The summer activities, they would, be gatherers of wild berries, and then they would be fishermen. They also had their own gardens. It's pretty hard to believe that, our people had some sort of that form of gardening in their culture. Since we were hunters, since we were trappers. But I think we got that from the missionaries that came around that era, the 1930s, 1940s. And of course, they also picked wild rice, which is their main staple diet: fish, meat, and wild rice. Most of the winter's activities were prepared for in the fall, because in the winter, most of the people of Grassy would go out on the trap lines, as I said earlier. For most of you that are not familiar with the term trap lines, there's just a designated area, either recognized by the provincial government as traditional hunting grounds for certain individuals or clans. And in the fall they prepared their cabins, sort of, getting ready for winter. They also prepared their traps for the winter, their tools, whatever they need, in those days they had, it wasn't, surprising to see dog teams. This goes back a long ways. I think the last dog team was worked, I like to say, use that term, worked, back in 1958 or 59. That was the last time that they used dog teams. And in the 1960s, that's when everything changed. But I won't go into that right now because I want to speak a little bit more on the history of the people as trappers and hunters. Now, most of the families, they prepared for winter by, storing or filling up their winter catches with fish, meat, vegetables, and berries. Dried, smoked fish, meat. And this came in handy, especially when you have to go out in the trap line all winter. That was your main diet. We didn't have anything like canned stuff in those days. If they had canned stuff, it was just more like a burden to them because it took up a lot of room. Whereas with dried fish and meat, you just could leave it at your cabin or in the winter catch or wherever your cabins are. Now every family, every member of the family had specific duties that you had to do. Even even the children helped out in the winter trap lines. Because in those days, most of the children didn't go to school anyways; they stayed at home. Some of those that went off to school went to residential schools, either in Macintosh, which was about, as the crow flies, southwest from Grassy Narrows, about 40 miles, or to Kenora, as I said earlier, which is about 60 miles. You had two residential schools there. But as I said earlier, for those that didn't go to school, they helped out on the trap lines. Check the snares, rabbit snares, bring in firewood, help clean the beaver pelts, whatnot. And the success depended on one's ability to perform his duties. One member of the family, it's very important that he or she does their assigned duties, because if they don't, then the whole family has to suffer. Which sometimes is very tragic. There has been some other, stories that were related to me, where there was some near starvation on trap lines, because there was, there hardly enough food, because of poor planning, poor judgment on the part of whoever is supposed to be doing that. Now, with the coming of spring, a lot of preparations were made, to move back to the summer camps. And this was a time, that was the highlight of their social life in the spring. Because there's a period there's, you can't do anything, much of anything. Because, between the spring break and when the water runs, you're confined to your place. You can't travel out in the lake because, you might fall through. You can't use your canoe, so you can't paddle, your mobility is somewhat limited. And this was a time that the people used to socialize. And most of them, they had what you call they had what you call powwows, or some form of powwows. Not on a grand scale, or not on a fancy level that the present day powwows that you see, that some people, they hold on an annual basis. But those kind of powwows were reserved for the community only. And it's more like a form of celebration, because they're glad to see their friends after months out on a trap line. Because out on the trap line, you're all by yourself with your family. Things could get pretty tense out there, especially within the family group. So, so in the spring, that's when everybody was there. Really, that was the long-awaited time, so that every family would get together again. They share ideas, and when they see each other, because in the summer camps, they're somewhat closer to one another. When I say closer, I think they might, the closest, your closest neighbor might be about a mile, or maybe across the lake. So they used to travel either by a canoe or by walking, whichever is safe. They used to have these nil powwows at nights. They played cards, and they told stories about, what happened out in the trap line. And spring also meant, a lot of work for the fishermen, because they had to mend their they had to mend their nets that they used to commercial fish with. They had to break the ground, for those that want to make gardens. So it was an endless cycle of changing events. A life that was geared to changing every time when the seasons require. Now the social structure of the people had its own standards. And I won't even try to define what I mean by that, because I only have a vague idea. Because it's been, I'm going back before 1960. So I don't know much about that, but I will speak a little bit on what they did for social activities and that. Maybe I should have I'll backtrack a little bit. I should have said that right from the outset. I myself wasn't born and raised on a reservation. So it wasn't only 1970 that I decided to move back to the reservation. And I was only about 19 years old at the time when I moved back. Fortunately, I quit my schooling when I was in grade 10. Sort of regret that now. I place a lot of emphasis when I speak to children how important education is in this day and age. So this is why I say I only have a vague idea of how the social structure was in the old reserve back then. But most of the social events that took place were centered around large gatherings, like ceremonies. Like our people, they love to celebrate. Give them a reason to celebrate and they'll do it, even today, for no reason at all. But but in those days, it meant something for the whole community to sit around in one big community area, usually in a community hall, or in a big wide open space, and have a feast, a Thanksgiving feast, a feast that meant something in those days. They had dancing, they had singing. It was at those gatherings that a lot of people, especially our old people today, they sort of missed that. Because in this day, right now, in the present day, there's hardly anything for the old people, for our elders. They're just confined at home and that's it. Everything is new. And it's a sad story to see our elders, long for the old days. Because our story is the same thing like many other reserves across Canada and into the United States. Sometimes I used to sit around at home. I had the opportunity to live with with an elder I lived at the same house as he did. He was blind, couldn't see, but that elder, he taught me quite a bit about the how life was in the old reserve. Because he himself was a counselor, and he was also a chief for so many years. Then we used to spend sometimes an entire evening, after I come home from work, I used to sit there and I used to listen to this old man speak of days gone by. How the people of Grasnarys used to govern themselves as a people. So much different today as compared to those days. Just an example of that. Back in the old days, they used to, like whenever a dispute erupted between families, then it was always the elder of the family that settled it by his own judgment. He had the last and final word and what should be. And once that was said, then that was done. And to question that, would bring anybody nothing but discontempt and disgrace in the eyes of the community. Because actually what that person did is questioning his own elder. And that was considered to be a disgrace. I think that applies to any society. And that's the way it was a long time ago. And if there was a dispute between two clans, then the matter was settled by the headmen of either clan. The two groups, the elder of each group would come forward and they'd talk. It was dealt between them. It was, it wasn't very often that a third party intervention was required, because usually both of them used to settle it out. If they were still squabbling after, if there was nothing accomplished, then a third party invention, which was, in those days, he was the head chief. And he had the last say. And he had the power to settle all disputes within the community. Today, I guess that would be referred to as the present-day chief. And sometimes, the workload was too much for one chief, so they had to get individual clan head of clans to help this chief. So this was somewhat like the present-day counselors, band counselors, that helped in settling the matters and running the day-to-day business. But in those days, we didn't have any business like what we have today. Because we led a very simple life. We looked after our own. And we had only one law, and that's the law to respect your neighbor and his property, and respect your elders. If you could do that, then you're okay. You had no problems with anybody. But to do otherwise, then you are considered an outcast from the entire community. And this is how my people lived back then. And that was how they governed themselves. We had very few problems. They had problems. I'm not saying that they didn't have any, but they had problems. But none was too big that that they couldn't handle. Because in those days, respect was taught quite, when you were as soon as you were able to walk, you were taught to respect your parents, you were taught to respect your elders. But today is somewhat different. And those are the problems I'll be talking about tonight. The problems of our community. Maybe most of you are familiar with what the typical reserve problems are, but you don't have a clue what causes those problems. It's a known fact that there's a lot of alcoholism on the reserves. That's true. But to go into detail as to the reason why, I think I'd spend all night standing here talking about it, so I won't bother with that. But some of the problems, just to give you an idea of what our people, and it's typical across Canada, on reservations anywhere, are the ones that are, within the social and economic and political aspects. The education system is one. The housing program is another. And the employment, high rate of unemployment is another. Now, what's that got to do with all the problems on the reserve? Well, I will try to talk about that in a little bit. What's the problems with the education system got to do with the problems of the reserve? Sometimes it really, sometimes it angers me, when somebody says, you people are very fortunate to have everything paid by the Department of Indian Affairs, which is quite true. But when you look at it in terms of dollars and cents, what do you get for your quality? And it's not very, surprising, because I spent a lot of time studying, especially on our reserve, how much money were allocated in one fiscal year for our education budget. And that's got to last this whole year, because that's got to last, to look at the administration cost of it, the operation and maintenance, and plus the tuition. And what do you get for quality education is another. Just the other day, my young girl, who was about 6 years old, came home. She had a reader. I think she's in grade 2 now. She brought home a reader. And I just had to laugh at the kind of books that they read in school nowadays. It almost reminds me of the days when Dick and Jane were in the series. It's almost something that's similar to it. Now that's the kind of education, the quality of education we get. And and people ask why. Why is there such a high rate of dropouts? Native students. Well, a lot of people say, well, culture shock. There's a lot of other answers that they give. But, the truth of the matter is how much money that's allocated to each band is what makes them different. When I say band, I mean a reserve. Because each reserve is given so much based on their population. It's how much they want to operate in their education system. So there's a lot of policies, there's a lot of, politics that go in it. And the Indian affairs, you ask them to sort of, asks, to put a lot of more funds in the education. Well, they got their hands tied as well. That's the other side of the coin. We want more, but the Indian affairs say we can't have them. Because that's all they're able to get from Treasury Board. Now, I don't want to get too political on this subject, but I feel that I must have to say that because that's one of the problems that we're facing, because we've got limited budgets. So what do you get out of limited budgets? You only get limited education. But we're at fault too ourselves. There's no question about that. As I said earlier, I myself is an example of where I dropped out at grade 10. But my reasons for dropping out is different to somebody else's. They all got different problems. But education is one of the problems that we have. I was asked one day, well, what do you need then in your education program? Do you have any alternatives? Well, I could go on and list a whole bunch of alternatives. But what good is that going to do if, there's, like I said earlier, sometimes it's our own problem. Then you take a look at the housing program, which too also causes a lot of problems in our reserve. But 5 years ago, the Grassy Narrows band were having a lot of problems with education and housing. Now, I asked the chief in those days, 5 years ago, what's your main concern? What do you consider a priority in this reserve? For one chief, he said, housing is my most priority. And then the other one that took his place about a year after said, education is my priority. So what I'm saying here, the problems that are brought out by our people differs from year to year. Because every year, almost, for the past 5 years, our band, our people, hold elections every year. There was one article that I read in the newspaper. I think it was a Canadian Press It was about Grassy Narrows. And it really got me very angry when I read that part where it said that the Grassy Narrows band, within 1 year span, had elected 3 chiefs to run their community. Like what I'm saying is they went through three of them, but they didn't say why. Didn't say why they did that. Well, I'll tell you why. Because I happened to be one of the chiefs. For one thing, my term was up, because I was only an interim chief that time. Then the one that took over after I got out of office, he was voted out because of political ties. And then another one, the present day chief that we have right now, he's on the verge of losing his seat too because of political ties. So there's a lot of problems, internal problems in our community. Internal unrest. Because our people have been going through a lot of changes within the past 10 years. You know, there was one elder that I had the opportunity of talking to at great length. I got him to talk about the old reserve and that. But I also got him to talk about the changes that the band had went through. And he said that, that the people of Grassy Narrows have seen a lot of more changes in the past 10 years. They've been through a lot of changes. They've been through a lot of changes than any other group would have faced in a lifetime. Because in the 1960s, early 1960s, that's when the reserve was relocated to where it is now, the present site. Could you imagine uprooting a whole community and moving it some 5 miles down the road, and the problems that it would cause? I mean, you have to break traditional ties with the land that you have, been sacred. That meant life to you. Move you away from a river, that meant, that brought life to you. Move you away from a piece of land that gave you life, and move you to a place where there's nothing but mud, and expect you to change and to try to make a living on that piece of land. When they moved that community, there were 3 promises. 1, better education facilities and better quality education. We will build you a new school if you move. No longer will you have to send your children away to residential schools. You'll have your own school right here on the reserve. We'll have them. And you'll have the best teachers. That was one promise. The other promise was housing. In the days of the at the old reserve, as you'll see in the slide presentation, they had log cabins. just like in the early pioneer days, they had log cabins. Now, the department said, if you move, we'll give you new housing. We'll build you new housing. We'll create jobs for you. That was the second promise. And the last was that we'll give you hydro and we'll give you running water in your homes. Plumbing. Well, on the last one about running water, I guess they partly fulfilled that by, one is to take a look at the housing in the winter. And I'm not kidding when I say this. I was in one home. That's when I was making my rounds as a chief. I went and visit one family. And I noticed on the wall, just below the ceiling, there's frost. There's running water coming out of there. I think that's what they meant by giving us housing with running water in it. More specific at those days. They should have at least said condensation, and I would have, we wouldn't have moved. Well, anyways, to date, we got a school. The first school that was built was in 1963. Which is today our present Ban administration office, because they built us another one back in 1975. But I still say, structures, doesn't produce scholars. You could give you the best school, but they won't produce any scholars. I could give you the best teachers, they still won't produce any scholars coming from there. So there's got to be a problem there. And that brings us right back to the curriculum, the content of the education, as I said earlier, the quality of education. Then when you look at the housing, they gave us houses, all right, but one outstanding promise today is we still don't have any plumbing in our homes. In this day and age, with the nearest town 60 miles south of us, which is Kenora, every home in Kenora's got running water except up north, Grassy Narrows. And I guess I speak for every reserve in northwestern Ontario when I say that. Because I think there's, just recently now, up in northwestern Ontario, they're starting a program, housing program, what the Indian Affairs calls experimental housing. And that's to give, housing with full basement, with running, with plumbing and all that. I wonder if they realize it's 1983 now. That should have happened a long time ago. Today, Grassy Narrows, what do we do for water? Well, we get it from an intake pump house, just down the hill from the Ban administration building. There's a pump house there. But, that the location of that pump house, the water intake, that causes a lot of problems too, because in the spring, this isn't, the water level, the table, the land looks somewhat like this. You got housing, the land looks like that, and that's where the water intake is. So you just could imagine in the springtime, the spring runoff, all that winter sludge and all that goes right down to the lake. All the snow and mud and whatnot, they go right down to the lake. And then in the spring, all you see in front of the water intake is just nothing but brown-colored film on top the ice. Now the problem from that is that you got sickness. Now we have to drink that water. And that's for the past 10 years, it's just like bumping my head through that wall over there, trying to talk to Indian Affairs. They won't budge. They just refuse to do anything because of policies. They see the problem right there, right in front of their eyes. Every spring they come up there. And they see that problem. Brown water that causes diarrhea. And that also causes a lot of other sicknesses. And then during the summertime, you got all that garbage on the community as well. We asked for funding one time to try to get some sort of a sanitation program going. Here again was another problem. No money. When you talk about hydro, electricity, that was one of the promises that they gave us back in 1960. If we move the reserve, we'll give you hydro, water. It wasn't until 1975 that we got hydro into the reserve. Now you're looking at 15 years there. 15 years to fulfill a promise. Would have been better off to leave the reserve where it was and just build a road in there. We were asked one time, do you have proof of all this? Here again, that it's not our problem, because we weren't really that well advanced, politically advanced in those days. But the Department of Indian Affairs should have been. At least they should have kept some sort of documents or some sort of a file. Saying why we moved, why they want us to move, why did they move us in the first place. It's a known fact by our people we didn't want to move, but we were forced to move. And we say that time and time again in our presentations to the government. And it's a great embarrassment to the Indian Affairs when we tell them about all our problems. The other problems that happen on a reserve, as I said earlier, it's a known fact, it's alcoholism. Sad but true. You'd picture, people like myself the ones with the problem, which would be acceptable. But how many of you would have seen a drunken kid as young as 5 years old, running around 5 o'clock in the morning? Our little kids are starting that at age 5. They see their parents doing it, drinking. They see their older brother and sisters doing it, drinking. So why not them? They wait until everybody else passes out, and they go ahead and drink it. That's a known fact. But how many of you have heard of little children sniffing gas? Gasoline. That's another problem that we have. About 10 years ago, if you were to drive up the Grassy Narrows, you wouldn't have seen that. But 5 years ago, that happened. And it's sad, because now there are 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds that are addicted to that now. A waste. What happened? Whose fault is it? You know, a lot of people blame everybody. Blame it on Indian affairs. They're the rat that chase around. But how many of them are, will say, blame it on yourself. Blame it on your own chief and council. Which is true sometimes. I myself did that one time. I didn't listen. There was a group that came up to me and said, look, you got to do something about the problem of gas sniffing with these kids. What are you going to do about it? Oh, I listened to them. That group, they made their presentation. After they left, I picked up the phone and talked to Indian Affairs about economic development. I made that mistake. So it's our own leaders too, sometimes that don't listen. That's part of the problem. I did that when I was chief. And as a result of that, just as recently as 2 months ago, I resigned from the council. Why? Is it because I'm fed up with the whole thing? No, it's not because I was fed up. It's because I was burnt out. There's a lot of pressure on them in today's chief and council, the role as a chief in the council. Because you not only run the administration of programs, but you're also got to play the role of the counselor. A marriage counselor, an alcohol counselor, an education counselor. You wear many hats. And on top of all that, you got to try to live your own private life. And so I found myself trying to solve a lot of other problems other than my own. So some of the problems are that the chief and council won't listen. Then what happens? The kids say, what's the use? You won't listen anyways. The kids, they give up. So what did they do when they give up? There's a lot of things that they do. They take drugs, chemicals, alcohol, gas. When do they start? As young as 5 years old. When do they quit? When they're in a grave. What happens in between? What happens in between that time? They could do a lot of damage. A lot of kids, 16, 17-year-olds, they know that nobody doesn't want to listen anyways. The parents are always, sometimes they're drunk. They don't have any voice in the community meetings. Or they're scared to talk out because they might be ridiculed. So who listens? Nobody listens. So what do? Trying to get attention. They smoke, drink, beatings. They even kill. And they even kill themselves. Back in 1970, we tried to do something about the alcohol problem on the reserve. We tried everything. Because alcohol was ruining marriages, busting up families, loss of life. So we tried to control it. We tried to do something with it. So we banned alcohol in the reserve. Said no more alcohol in the reserve. That's it. So we officially made the reserve a dry reserve. What happened? It didn't work. Because Grassy Narrows is about 60 miles north of Kenora, accessible by road. So the people went into Kenora. They know they couldn't bring the alcohol into the reserve, so what they do, they went to Kenora. They spent days on end in Kenora. They drank weeks at a time in Kenora. They were a nuisance in Kenora. Where were all the kids all the time? Children's Aid had high cases of child abandonment, child neglect. That's what happened. The police, they had statistics of, there was a high rate of assaults with deadly weapons, knifings, shootings, beatings between family members and other. Within 1970 alone, I think there must have been about 10 homicides. That's sad. That's a sad story. So it's not only Indian affairs that are at fault, it's also our own people that are at fault. Now, today what have we done? What have we done today to try and meet all these problems, to try to rectify all these problems? Just 5 years ago, we started getting support programs. Before, the province didn't listen to us. The provincial government said, no, you're not our responsibility. go to the federal government. But now they're starting to listen now because they're starting to realize. More and more people are starting to realize what the problems are and how best they could be met. For alcohol, we've got AA people. We've got our own AA group, which was started about 10 years ago. It's the only group that's functioning right now. And we've got a crisis intervention program. I pioneered that program. I started it back in 1978. But my purpose, my goal at that time was to try to send the kids off to an earlier age that are small kids, trying to get them home in an earlier hour. I wanted them to be home by 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock so that they could go to school next morning. That was my main purpose. But since then, that program has advanced into, just what the program says, crisis intervention. They reach out to a lot more young people. It has brought down the suicide rate quite a bit. And it has also brought down the violence among the younger people. Not only that, it also saved quite a bit of lives. Final word and what should be. Not only that, it also saved quite a bit of lives with our older people that passed out along the road, especially in the dead of winter. Today we've got a child care program. We got our own child care worker, one of our own band members. We've got our own alcohol counselor, who also plays a different role as a band counselor. We got an outreach program, to try to create jobs and all that for whatever age group. But the one thing that we don't have yet is a recreation director. And what's that got to do with the, try to stabilize the problems? Well, being away from, being far from the nearest town, one tends to get to be a bit bored up in the north, especially if we've only got one channel on TV. You've got to have some sort of other form of recreation. We don't have that. The kids, they get bored after a while. Not only kids, but also people, they get bored of sitting around doing nothing. Which is the reason why most of them drink quite a bit. If we had that, if we had something, we would have a recreation program that would meet these needs. But I did have the opportunity to try and talk to one of the. We did have a program at one time dealing with recreation. And I had a talk with that guy why he quit that program. He said, well, he couldn't really do anything because, you were competing with 3 other or 4 other different groups trying to provide recreation, unorganized recreation. So it didn't amount to anything. So he quit. No, I just want to talk a little bit on the what's the problem with the, why is there a lot of problems? I said earlier, the medical services is not a problem that we have. The education is not a problem that we have. Because most of these are, they're run by the federal government or a joint funding, the province. And we got our hands tied, when we're trying to speak, when we're trying to ask for some sort of additional funding, because, as elected leaders of the community, we're supposed to be the spokesman to trying to get more funding. So we go to people like Union Affairs and Medical Services, what do they tell us? They have also superiors that they have to talk to. They have their superiors that they have to talk to. So it's just a whole chain reaction of, bureaucracy, one department, intergovernmental departments. So they made us all with the policies and all that, so that's what causes a lot of problems. And most of our people, they don't understand that. They get after us, they get discontented with us, so they kick us out of office. Now, I looked around with other reserves where they have a continuity of leadership. A perfect example of that would be the Whitefish Bay. The Whitefish Bay Band in northwestern Ontario. Those people, they have their own factory, fur factory. It's called Shangweshi. It makes fur coats from pelts and all that. They also got a very good daycare center. They were one of the first reserves to have their own stores, community store. And they're the first reserve in northwestern Ontario to have their own control of Indian education. How did they do it? Because they're people, they had faith in them. They stuck with them through hard times. They had a chief there that's been chief there now for about 15 years. Now that says a lot. Only just recently, about a year ago, he was replaced. Now that says quite a bit after 15 years of the same leader, able to get all these things. And here we are, north of them, about 100 miles. What do we do? Every year, we're facing an election. In March, there will be another election for a new chief and council. So we're at fault as well, because we don't have faith in our own leaders. And this is one of the things that the people of Grasslands don't want to bring out. Why? I myself, I've been kind of embarrassed to bring that up, but that I don't anymore. I feel that it's something that has to be said, something that has to be told. Why all these problems occurred? Because the people don't believe in themselves anymore. Because they lost quite a bit. They've been through quite a few changes. They had to accept a system that they didn't want. They had to accept a move that they didn't want. I guess by some standards, in comparison with other groups of people, we're very lucky. By far, very lucky. But in comparison with our other neighboring reserves, we're far behind. We have to catch up because, we were the last ones. Just recently, as about a year ago, we were the last reserve to accept the Indian Act, to vote our people in office under the Indian Act. Whereas before we had elected our leaders, our chief and council by band custom. And under band custom, whenever the leadership is not producing anything, then they kick them out. Should be interesting to find out what's going to happen now that we're under the Indian Act, because, under the Indian Act, the leadership stays for 2 years, regardless who says what. You're stuck for 2 years with that term, and that's it. The only way you could get out of that term is by getting yourself in trouble with the law, or falling in disgrace with the Indian Affairs. Which I like to say, it's not too easy. It's not too hard neither. It's quite a relationship with a history. No. Today, I was thinking. All day I was thinking of what I would be talking about this evening. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, ever since Mr. Higgins gave me a call. And I sat down and I tried to write, which isn't always the best for me. Because I speak, when I speak to a large group of people, or when I speak to a group of people, I speak right from here. Right from here, that's where I speak from. It's no good for me to try to speak to you from up here. Because from up here is what I've been learning about when I was going to school. But if I learn to speak to you from here, then it means a lot. Because what I have been through, as a chief and as a counselor, I have been fighting for my people. I think in more ways than now, I'm fighting with them when I should be working with them. But it happens that way. You fight for your people's rights, and you fight for what you believe is right. But sometimes you find yourself fighting with your own kind. Where does that get you? In some cases it doesn't get you anywhere. But in some cases it teaches you quite a bit. Keeps you on your toes quite a bit. And I'd just like to take a coffee break this time, and I'll get into the slide presentations, and I will try to, if not, so much the better. Thank you.